The morning sky over Brookfield was the color of dull pewter, the kind of heavy gray that seemed to press down on the streets and make the air smell faintly of rain. A fine mist clung to the wrought iron gate at the top of Hillcrest Avenue, its black bars slick and cold under Martha Wilkins's gloved hand. She stood there for a moment, her breath puffing white in the crisp air, the wind teasing loose strands of graying hair from beneath her scarf. Her other hand gripped the strap of her worn leather handbag, the same one she'd carried for over 20 years, its corners scuffed but still serviceable. She glanced up the long driveway. It was lined with tall, swaying sycamores whose bare branches clawed at the low clouds. At the end stood a large stone house, the kind that looked as though it had been there for over a century. Its windows were tall and symmetrical, the shutters painted deep green. A light glowed faintly behind one window on the second floor. Martha hesitated. She had been a widow for nearly 10 years, and in that time, the walls of her small, quiet home had closed in tighter with each passing season. She had kept busy enough, cooking simple meals for herself, attending church on Sundays, tending her small vegetable patch, but the evenings were the worst. Tea for one, the tick of the clock in an empty kitchen. She hadn't come here today out of pure need for work. If she was honest with herself, she had come because the silence at home had grown unbearable. The ad hadn't even been an ad. A neighbor, Mrs. Calloway, had mentioned it over the fence 2 days ago. There's a house on Hillcrest. Big one. Belongs to some widower with children. He's looking for a cook, so they say. You should go, Martha. You're wasted rattling around that house of yours. Martha wasn't sure what she'd expected when she climbed the hill. Perhaps a servant at the door, or an officious housekeeper who would send her away. But instead, she found herself pressing the brass button on the gate's intercom. The latch clicked, and the gate creaked open slowly, as though reluctant to let her in. She walked the gravel path up to the front door, her shoes crunching with each step. The cold air seemed sharper here, and she felt the faintest flutter of nerves in her stomach. When she reached the door, tall, with a gleaming brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, she raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed deep inside, like striking the walls of an empty cathedral. After a few moments, the door swung open. A man stood there, tall, perhaps in his early 40s. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, as though he had been in the middle of some task. His hair was dark and slightly mussed, his jaw shadowed with stubble. His eyes, a clear gray blue, studied her for a moment before he spoke. You're the applicant. His voice was even, but there was a flicker of uncertainty there. Martha straightened her shoulders. I was told you needed a cook, she said softly, her words careful but firm. He stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in. The warmth hit her first, not just from the heating, but from the faint scent of wood smoke and something sweeter, maybe cookies baked not long ago. The entry hall was wide and high-ceilinged, with polished wood floors and a grand staircase sweeping upward in a graceful curve. The walls were lined with framed photographs and paintings of landscapes. I'm Daniel Cross, the man said, leading her toward a doorway on the left. His voice carried a hint of something unspoken, something weighed down by memory. This is an unusual arrangement, I suppose. I'm not looking for just anyone. The kitchen they stepped into was bright but in disarray. Dishes sat drying on a rack by the sink. A mixing bowl with a spoon still in it sat on the counter, and there were crumbs scattered around a cutting board. In the corner, near the table, a small pile of toys lay abandoned, a plastic truck, a doll missing one shoe, and a few crayons rolling on the floor. Martha's eyes softened. She had not expected children to be part of this. How old are they? She asked, glancing back at him. 6 and 8, he said quietly. Their mother passed away last year. They need someone who can cook, yes, but also, someone who can make the place feel like home again. There was no flourish to his words, no attempt to soften the truth. He was simply telling her how it was. Before Martha could reply, there was the faint sound of quick, light footsteps in the hallway, followed by 2 small figures peeking around the doorway. The girl had a mop of chestnut hair that looked as though it had resisted every attempt at taming that morning. The boy clutched a stuffed fox so worn its fur was matted, one ear barely hanging on by a few stitches. Their eyes were wide, curious, cautious, assessing this stranger who had appeared in their kitchen. Martha felt a tug deep inside her chest. She smiled at them, not the tight, polite smile of a stranger, but the gentle curve of someone who had spent years coaxing children out of shyness. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose we should start with breakfast. Everyone's friendlier on a full stomach." The boy's mouth twitched toward a grin before he ducked back behind the doorway, dragging his sister with him. Daniel leaned against the counter, his arms folded, watching Martha as though trying to read something in her expression. "You don't seem put off," he said finally. "By children. Never." She took off her gloves and set her handbag down on the table, already scanning the kitchen with the quiet decisiveness of someone who knew her way around a stove. "Do you have eggs?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, but he nodded. "Yes. Fresh. In the fridge." She moved toward it without hesitation, and for the first time that morning, a faint smile flickered across Daniel's face. Neither of them knew it then, but in that moment, with a pan warming on the stove, two small faces lurking in the hallway, and the rain beginning to tap against the kitchen windows, the shape of all their lives began to shift. The house would not be quite so quiet after today. And perhaps, just perhaps, neither would Martha's heart. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke in the late afternoon. Rain lashed against the tall windows of the Cross family's dining room, blurring the view of the sycamore trees outside into gray silhouettes swaying in the wind. The house was warm and filled with the comforting aroma of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and the faint citrus of a lemon tart cooling on the counter. Martha stood at the head of the dining table, laying out the last of the plates. She had found a linen tablecloth tucked away in a drawer earlier, slightly wrinkled, but clean, and decided it would do. The silverware was polished, the glasses gleamed in the soft glow of the chandelier. She had set two smaller plates close together at one end for the children, and one larger at the other for Daniel. Her own place was at the side, unobtrusive but close enough to join in if invited. When she first arrived that morning, she had thought she was here only for an interview. Instead, Daniel had simply left her in the kitchen, as though testing her by silence. The hours had slipped away as she moved through the space, taking stock of what was in the pantry, chopping onions, seasoning the chicken, kneading bread dough. She hadn't cooked for a family in years, but her hands remembered. Her mind worked on instinct. The way to balance herbs, how to time the oven so everything came together at once. Now, the food was ready, and the dining room was waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, lighter ones first, then heavier. The children came in, their cheeks flushed from some indoor game, hair a little mussed. The boy, Thomas, she had learned, was the first to notice the food. His eyes widened at the sight of the golden chicken resting in its roasting pan, the skin glistening under the light. The girl, Emily, hovered behind him, sniffing the air. "Is this, for us?" Thomas asked, almost suspiciously. Martha smiled. "For all of you. Sit down, before it gets cold." Daniel entered then, wearing a fresh shirt, his hair damp as though he'd just washed up. He stopped briefly in the doorway, taking in the sight, the table set, the smell of real food filling the air. His gaze flicked to Martha, and something unreadable passed across his face. "You didn't have to," he began. "I know," Martha interrupted gently, without looking up from pouring water into the glasses. "But I wanted to." They sat down. Thomas immediately reached for the bread, his small fingers tugging at the crust, and Emily giggled when it came apart in his hands. Martha served the chicken, cutting generous portions for each, adding roasted carrots and potatoes alongside. The children dug in almost immediately, the room filling with the sounds of forks against plates and small, contented sighs. Daniel, however, ate more slowly. He seemed to be studying her between bites, as though trying to understand what exactly had walked into his house today. "You're good," he said finally, nodding toward the food. "Too good for someone who's just looking for a cooking job." Martha set down the serving spoon. She met his gaze evenly, though there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "I'm looking for more than a job, Mr. Cross. Cooking is just the easiest part for me to offer." The rain outside grew heavier, the wind rattling the windows. The children didn't notice. Emily was telling her brother a story about a squirrel she'd seen in the yard that morning, and Thomas was busy imagining what it might do if it came inside. Martha listened, smiling at their chatter. Daniel's voice cut softly into the warmth. "It's been hard for them," he said, glancing toward the children but keeping his words low enough that they couldn't hear. "Since their mother died, I've tried, but," he trailed off, the words catching. Martha didn't press. She simply nodded, her hands folded on the table. She knew loss when she saw it. She recognized the look in his eyes, the way grief left a shadow, even on the days when life went on. When the meal was done, the children reluctantly pushed back their chairs, both asking in overlapping voices if there might be dessert. Martha laughed softly. "There's a lemon tart in the kitchen. But you'll have to help me carry it in." They darted off together, their footsteps echoing on the wood floor. Martha began gathering plates, but Daniel stopped her with a raised hand. "Leave it," he said. "I'll do it later." She hesitated. "Old habits," she said with a small shrug. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain's steady drumming seemed to fill the space between them. Then Daniel said, "You fit here." Strangely quickly. Martha looked down at the tablecloth, smoothing one corner with her fingers. "Homes aren't walls and roofs," she said quietly. "They're the moments people make inside them. I can't change what you've lost. But I can help fill the quiet." The words seemed to settle in the air, unforced, as though they'd been waiting to be spoken. When the children returned, carrying the tart between them like a treasure, the room brightened again. They ate dessert with sticky fingers and laughter, the storm outside forgotten. Later, as Martha pulled on her coat in the entryway, Daniel walked her to the door. "If you want the job," he said, his tone steady but his eyes searching hers, "it's yours. But understand, it's not just cooking. It's everything else." Martha met his gaze. "I understand," she said. And she did, more than he knew. When she stepped out into the rain, the cold drops on her face felt different, almost lighter. She had walked up that driveway this morning a lonely widow. She was leaving tonight with the quiet knowledge that perhaps, for the first time in years, she had found a place where she belonged. Inside the house, Daniel stood for a long moment watching her walk down the gravel path, the children's voices still carrying from the dining room. The rain blurred her figure until she turned the corner, disappearing from view. Somewhere deep down, he knew that this was the start of something, not a replacement for what had been lost, but the beginning of a new shape for their lives, one he hadn't dared imagine until now.